The Story of the Invisible Kingdom in the Diamond Fairy Book, from the German of Richard Leander. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In a little house halfway up the mountainside, and about a mile from the other houses of the village, there lived with his old father a young man called George. There was just enough land belonging to the house to enable the father and son to live free from care. Immediately behind the house the wood began. The oak trees and beech trees in which were so old that the grandchildren of the people who had planted them had been dead for more than 100 years. But in front of the house there lay a broken old millstone. Who knows how it got there? Anyone sitting on the stone would have a wonderful view of the valley down below, with the river flowing through it, and of the mountains rising on the other side of the river. In the evening, when he had finished his works in the fields, George often sat here for hours at a time dreaming, with his elbows on his knees and his head in his hands. And because he cared little for the villagers, but generally went about silent and absorbed like one who was thinking of all sorts of things, the people nicknamed him George the Dreamer, but he did not mind it at all. The older he grew, the more silent he became, and when at last his old father died, and he had buried him under a great old oak tree, he became quite silent. Then, when he sat on the broken millstone, as he did more often than before, and looked down into the lovely valley, and saw how the evening mists came into the valley at one end and slowly climbed the mountains, and how it then became darker and darker, until at last the moon and the stars appeared in the sky in their full glory, a wonderful feeling came into his heart. The waves of the river began to sing, quite softly at first, but gradually louder, until they could be heard quite plainly. And they sang of the mountains, down from which they had come, and of the sea to which they wished to go, and of the nixies who lived far down at the bottom of the river. Then the forest began to rustle, quite differently from an ordinary forest, and I used to relate the most wonderful tales. The old oak tree especially, which stood at his father's grave, knew far more than all the other trees. The stars, high up in the sky, wanted so much to tumble down into the green forest and the blue water, that they twinkled and sparkled as if they could not bear it any longer. But the angels who stand behind the stars held them firmly in their places, and said, "Stars, stars, don't be foolish. You are much too old to do silly things, many thousands years old, and more. Stay quietly in your places." It was truly a wonderful valley, but it was only George the Dreamer who heard and saw all that. The people who lived in the valley had not a suspicion of it, for they were quite ordinary people. Now and then they hewed down a huge old tree, cut it up into firewood, and made a high stack, and then they said, "Now we shall be able to make our coffee again for some time." In the river they washed their clothes. It was very convenient. And even when the stars sparkled most beautifully, they only said, "It will be very cold tonight. Let us hope our potatoes won't freeze." Once George the Dreamer tried to bring them to see differently, but they only laughed at him. They were just quite ordinary people. Now, one day as he was sitting on the millstone and thinking that he was quite alone in the world, he fell asleep. Then he dreamt that he saw, hanging down from the sky, a golden swing, which was fastened to 2 stars by silver ropes. In the swing sat a charming princess, who was swinging so high that each time she touched the sky, then the earth, and then the sky again. Each time the swing came near the earth, the princess clapped her hands with joy, and then through George the Dreamer arose. But suddenly the ropes broke, and the swing, with the princess, flew far into the sky, farther and farther, until at last he could see it no longer. Then he woke up, and when he looked around, he saw a great bunch of roses lying beside him on the millstone. The next day he went to sleep again, and dreamt the same thing. And when he woke up, the roses were lying on the stone by his side. This happened every day for a whole week. Then George said to himself that some part of the dream must be true, because he always dreamt exactly the same thing. So he shut up his house and set out to seek the princess. After he had traveled for many days, he saw in the distance a country where the clouds touched the earth. He hastened towards it, but came, on his way, to a large forest. Here he suddenly heard fearful groans and cries, and on approaching the place from which they seemed to come, he saw a venerable old man with a silver-gray beard lying on the ground. Two horribly ugly naked fellows were kneeling on him, trying to strangle him. Then George the dreamer looked round to see whether he could find some sort of weapon with which to run the two fellows through the body. But he could find nothing, so, in mortal terror, he tore down a huge tree trunk. He had scarcely seized it when it changed in his hands into a mighty halberd. Then he rushed at the two monsters and ran them through the body, and they let go the old man and ran away howling. Then George lifted the old man up and comforted him, and asked him why the two fellows had wanted to choke him. The old man said that he was the king of dreams, and had come by mistake into the kingdom of his greatest enemy, the king of realities. The latter, as soon as he noticed this, had sent two of his servants to lie in wait for him and kill him. "Have you then done the king of realities any harm?" asked George the dreamer. "God forbid," the old man assured him. "He is always very easily provoked. That is his character. And me he hates like poison." "But the fellows he sent to strangle you were quite naked." "Yes, indeed," said the king, "stark naked. That is the fashion in their land of realities. All the people, even the king, go about naked, and are not at all ashamed. They are an abominable nation. But now, since you have saved my life, I will prove my gratitude to you by showing you my country. It is the most glorious country in the whole world, and dreams are my subjects." Then the Dream King went on in front, and George followed him. When they came to the place where the clouds touched the earth, the king showed him a trapdoor that was so well hidden in the thicket that not even a person who knew it was there would have been able to find it. He lifted it up and led his companion down 500 steps into a brightly lighted grotto that stretched for miles in undiminished splendor. It was unspeakably beautiful. There were castles on islands in the midst of large lakes, and the islands floated about like ships. If you wished to go into one of them, all you had to do was to stand on the bank and call out, "Little castle, swim to me, that I may get into thee." Then it came to the shore by itself. Farther on were other castles, on clouds, floating slowly in the air. But if you said, "Float down, little castle in the air, take me up to see thy beauties rare," they slowly floated down. Besides these, there were gardens with flowers which gave out a sweet smell by day and a bright light by night, beautifully tinted birds which told stories, and a host of other wonderful things. George could do nothing but wonder and admire. "Now I will show you my subjects, the dreams," said the king. "I have three kinds: good dreams for good people, bad dreams for bad people, and also dream goblins. With the last I amuse myself now and then, for a king must sometimes have a joke." So he took George into one of the castles, which was so queerly built that it looked irresistibly comical. Here the dream goblins live. They are a tiny, high-spirited, roguish lot, never do any harm, but love to tease. Then he called to one of the goblins, "Come here, little man, and be serious a moment for once in your life. Do you know," he continued, addressing George, "what this rogue does if I, once in a way, allow him to go down to the earth? He runs to the next house, drags the first man he comes across, who is sound asleep, out of bed, carries him to the church tower, and throws him down head over heels. Then he rushes down the stairs so as to reach the bottom first, catches the man, carries him home, and flings him so roughly into bed that the bedstead creaks horribly. Then the man wakes up, rubs the sleep out of his eyes, and says, "Dear me, I thought I was falling from the church tower. What a good thing it was only a dream." "Is that the one?" cried George. "Look here, he has been to me before, but if he comes again and I catch him, it will be the worse for him." He had scarcely finished speaking when another goblin sprang out from under the table. He looked like a little dog, for he had a very ragged waistcoat on, and he let his tongue hang out of his mouth. "He is not much better," said the king. "He barks like a dog and is as strong as a giant. When people in their dreams are frightened at something, he holds their hands and feet so that they cannot move." "I know him too," interrupted George. "When you want to run away, you feel as stiff and stark as a piece of wood. If you want to move your arms or your legs, you can't do it. But often it is not a dog, but a bear or a robber or some other horrid thing." "I will never allow them to come to you again, George the Dreamer," the king assured him. "Now come and see the bad dreams. But don't be afraid, they won't do you any harm. They are only for bad people." Then they passed through a great iron door into a vast space, enclosed by a high wall. Here the most terrible shapes and most horrible monsters were crowded together. Some looked like men, others like animals. Others were half men and half animals. George was terrified, and made his way back to the iron door. But the king spoke kindly to him, and persuaded him to see more closely what wicked people have to dream. Beckoning to a dream that stood near, a hideous giant with a mill wheel under each arm, he commanded him to tell them what he was going to do that night. Then the monster raised his shoulders, wriggled about with joy, grinned until his mouth met his ears, and said, "I am going to the rich man, who has let his father starve." One day, when the old man was sitting on the stone steps before his son's house, begging for bread, the son came and said to the servants, "Drive away that fellow." So I go to him at night and pass him through my mill wheels, until all his bones are broken into tiny pieces. When he is properly soft and quivering, I take him by the collar and shake him and say, "See how you tremble now, you fellow." Then he wakes up with his teeth chattering, and calls to his wife to bring him another blanket, for he is freezing. And when he has fallen asleep once more, I begin it all again. When George the Dreamer heard this, he rushed out through the door, dragging the king after him, and crying out that he would not stay a moment longer with the bad dreams. They were too horrible. The king next led him into a lovely garden where the paths were of silver, the beds of gold, and the flowers, beautifully cut precious stones. Here the good dreams were walking up and down. The first he saw was a pale young woman, with a Noah's Ark under one arm, and a box of bricks under the other. "Who is that?" asked the dreamer. "She goes every evening to a little sick boy, whose mother is dead. He is quite alone all day, and no one troubles about him. But towards evening she goes to him, plays with him, and stays the whole night. She goes early, because he goes to sleep early. The other dreams go much later. Let us proceed. If you want to see everything, we must make haste." Then they went farther into the garden, into the midst of the good dreams. There were men, women, old men, and children, all with dear, good faces, and most beautifully dressed. Many of them were carrying all sorts of things, everything that the heart can possibly wish for. Suddenly George stood still and cried out so loudly that all the dreams turned round to look. "What is the matter?" said the king. "There is my princess, she who has so often appeared to me, and who gave me the roses," George the Dreamer answered in an ecstasy. "Certainly, certainly it is she," said the king. "Have I not sent you a very pretty dream? It is almost the prettiest I have." Then George ran up to the princess, who was sitting swinging in her little golden swing. As soon as she saw him coming, she sprang down into his arms. But he took her by the hand, and led her to a golden bench, on which they both sat down, telling one another how sweet it was to meet again. And when they had finished saying so, they began again. The King of Dreams, meanwhile, walked up and down the broad path which goes straight through the garden, with his hands behind his back. Now and then he took out his watch, to see how the time was getting on, for George the Dreamer and the Princess never came to an end of what they had to say to one another. At length he went to them, and said, "That's enough, children. You, Dreamer, are far from your home, and I cannot keep you here overnight, for I have no beds. You see, the dreamers never sleep, but have to go up every night to men on the earth. And you, Princess, must make yourself ready. Dress yourself all in pink, and then come to see me, so that I may tell you to whom you must appear tonight, and what you must say." When George the Dreamer heard this, he felt more courageous than ever before in his life. Standing up, he said firmly, "My lord the king, I will never more leave my princess. You must either keep me here below, or let her go up with me to the earth. I love her too much to live without her." Then a tear big as a hazelnut came into each of his eyes. "But George," answered the king, "it is the prettiest dream I have. Still, you saved my life, so have your own way. Take your princess up with you. But as soon as you have got on to the earth, take off her silver veil and throw it down to me through the trapdoor. Then she will be of flesh and blood like every other child of man. Now she is only a dream." George the Dreamer thanked the king most heartily, and then said, "Dear king, because you are so very good, I should like to ask for one thing more. I have a princess now, but no kingdom. A princess without a kingdom is impossible. Cannot you get me one, if it is only a small one?" Then the king answered, "I have no visible kingdoms to give away, Dreamer, only invisible ones. One of the latter you shall have, one of the biggest and best that I possess." Then George asked what invisible kingdoms were like. The king told him he would find that out, and would be amazed at their beauty and magnificence. "You see," he said, "it is often very unpleasant to have anything to do with ordinary visible kingdoms. For example, suppose you are an ordinary king, and early one morning your minister comes to your bedside and says, 'Your Majesty, I want £100 for the kingdom.' Then you open your treasury and find not even a farthing in it. What are you to do? Or again, you wage a war and lose, and the king who has conquered you marries your princess and shuts you up in a tower. Such things cannot happen in invisible kingdoms." "But if we cannot see it, of what use would our kingdom be to us?" asked George, still somewhat puzzled. "You strange man," said the king, and pointing to his forehead, he continued, "you and your princess see it well enough. You see the castles and gardens, the meadows and forests which belong to your kingdom. You live in it, walk in it, do what you like with it. It is only other people who do not see it." Then the dreamer was highly delighted, for he was beginning to be afraid lest the village people should look enviously at him if he came home with his princess and was king. He took a very touching leave of the King of Dreams, climbed the 500 steps with his princess, took the silver veil off her head and threw it down. Then he wanted to shut the trapdoor, but it was so heavy that he could not hold it. So he let it fall, and the noise it made was as great as the noise of many cannons shot off at the same time, and for a moment he became unconscious. When he came to himself again, he was sitting in front of his cottage with the princess sitting on the millstone at his side, and she was of flesh and blood like any other person. She was holding his hand, stroking it, and saying, "You dear, good, stupid man, you have not dared to tell me how much you love me for such a long time. Have you been very much afraid of me?" And the moon rose and illumined the river. The waves beat against the banks, and the forest rustled, but they still sat there and talked. Suddenly it seemed as if a small black cloud was passing over the moon, and all at once something like a large folded shawl fell at their feet. Then the moon stood out again in her full glory. They lifted up the cloth and began to spread it out. But they took a long time over this, for it was very fine and folded many 100 times. When it was quite spread out, it looked like a large map. In the middle was a river, and on both sides were towns, forests, and lakes. Then they noticed that it was a kingdom, and knew that the good Dream King must have sent it down to them from the sky. And when they looked at their little cottage, it had become a beautiful castle, with glass stairs, marble walls, velvet carpets, and pointed blue-tiled towers. Then they took hands and went into the castle, where their subjects were already assembled. The servants bowed low, drums and trumpets sounded, and little pages went before them strewing flowers. They were king and queen. The next morning the news that George the Dreamer had come back, and had brought a wife with him, ran like wildfire through the village. "She is probably very clever," the people said. "I saw her early this morning when I went into the forest," said a peasant. "She was standing at the door with him. She is nothing special, quite an ordinary person, small and delicate-looking, and rather shabbily dressed. What did he see in her? He has nothing, and she probably has nothing." So the stupid people chattered, for they could not see that she was a princess, and in their stupidity they did not see that the house had changed into a great wonderful castle. For the kingdom that had come down from the sky for George the Dreamer was an invisible one. So he did not trouble about the stupid people, but lived happily and contentedly in his kingdom with his princess, who presented him with 6 children, each one more beautiful than the other, and they were all 6 princes and princesses. But no one in the village knew it, for they were quite ordinary people, and much too silly to notice it. End of the story of the Invisible Kingdom, from the German of Richard Leander. Recorded by Mari. Princess Crystal, or the Hidden Treasure. In the Diamond Fairy Book, by Isabel Bellerby. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. There were the 4 kings: the king of the north, the region of perpetual snow; the king of the south, where the sun shines all the year around; the king of the east, from whence the cold winds blow; and the king of the west, where the gentle zephyrs breathe upon the flowers, and coax them to open their petals while the rest of the world is still sleeping. And there was the great dragon, who lived on top of a high mountain in the center of the universe. He could see everything that happened everywhere by means of his magic spectacles, which enabled him to look all ways at once, and to see through solid substances. But he could only see, not hear, for he was as deaf as a post. Now the king of the north had a beautiful daughter called Crystal. Her eyes were bright like the stars, her hair was black like the sky at night, and her skin was as white as the snow which covered the ground outside the palace where she lived, which was built entirely of crystals clear as the clearest glass. And the king of the south had a son who had been named Sunshine on account of his brightness and warmth of heart. The king of the east had a son who, because he was always up early and was very industrious, had been given the name Sunrise. The king of the west also had a son, perhaps the handsomest of the 3, and always magnificently dressed. But as it took him all day to make his toilette, so that he was never seen before evening, he received the name of Sunset. All 3 princes were in love with the Princess Crystal, each hoping to win her for his bride. When they had the chance, they would go and peep at her as she wandered up and down in her glass palace. But she liked Prince Sunshine the best, because he stayed longer than the others, and was always such excellent company. Prince Sunrise was too busy to be able to spare her more than half an hour or so, and Prince Sunset never came until she was getting too tired and sleepy to care to see him. It was of no use, however, for her to hope that Sunshine would be her husband just because she happened to prefer him to the others. Her father, the stern and blusterous old king, with a beard made of icicles so long that it reached to his waist and kept his heart cold, declared that he had no patience for such nonsense as likes and dislikes. And one day he announced, far and wide, in a voice that was heard by the other 3 kings, and which made the earth shake so that the great green dragon immediately looked through his spectacles to see what was happening. He who would win my daughter must first bring me the casket containing the hidden treasure, which is concealed no man knows where. Of course the dragon was none the wiser for looking through his spectacles, because the words, loud though they were, could not be heard by his deaf ears. But the other kings listened diligently, as did the young princes, and poor Princess Crystal trembled in her beautiful palace lest Sunrise, who was always up so early, should find the treasure before Sunshine had a chance. She was not much afraid of the indolent Sunset, except that it might occur to him to look at some spot forgotten by his rivals. Very early indeed on the following morning did Prince Sunrise set to work. He glided along the surface of the earth, keeping close to the ground in his anxiety not to miss a single square inch. He knew he was not first in the field, for the Northern King's proclamation had been made towards evening on the previous day, and Prince Sunset had bestirred himself for once, and had lingered about rather later than usual, being desirous of finding the treasure and winning the charming princess. But the early morning was passing, and very soon the cheery, indefatigable Sunshine had possession of the entire land, and flooded Crystal's palace with a look from his loving eyes which bade her not despair. Then he talked to the trees and the green fields and the flowers, begging them to give up the secret in return for the warmth and gladness he shed so freely on them. But they were silent, except that the trees sighed their sorrow at not being able to help him, and the long grasses rustled a whispered regret, and the flowers bowed their heads in grief. Not discouraged, however, Prince Sunshine went to the brooks and rivers and asked their assistance, but they, too, were helpless. The brooks gurgled out great tears of woe, which rushed down to the rivers and so overcame them, sorry as they were on account of their own inability to help, that they nearly overflowed their banks, and went tumbling into the sea, who, of course, wanted to know what was the matter, but, when told, all the sea could do was to thunder a loud and continuous "No!" on all its beaches. So Prince Sunshine had to pass on and seek help elsewhere. He tried to make the great dragon understand, but it could not hear him. Other animals could, though, and he went from one to another, as cheerful as ever in spite of all the no's he had met with, until, at last, he knew by the twittering of the birds that he was going to be successful. "We go everywhere and learn most things," said the swallows, flying up and down in the air, full of excitement and joy at being able to reward their beloved Sunshine for all his kindness to them. "And we know this much, at any rate. The hidden treasure can only be found by him who looks at its hiding place through the dragon's magic spectacles." Prince Sunshine exclaimed that he would go at once and borrow these wonderful spectacles, but a solemn-looking old owl spoke up. "Be not in such a hurry, most noble prince. The dragon will slay anyone, even so exalted a personage as yourself, who attempts to remove those spectacles while he is awake, and, as is well known, he never allows himself to sleep, for fear of losing some important sight." "Then what is to be done?" asked the prince, beginning to grow impatient at last, for the afternoon was now well advanced, and Prince Sunset would soon be on the war-path again. A majestic eagle came swooping down from the clouds. "There is only one thing in all the world," said he, "which can send the dragon to sleep, and that is a caress from the hand of the Princess Crystal." Sunshine waited to hear no more. Smiling his thanks, he hastened away to put his dear Crystal's love to the test. She had never yet ventured outside the covered gardens of her palace. Would she go with him now, and approach the great dragon, and soothe its savage watchfulness into the necessary repose? As he made the request, there stole into the princess's cheeks the first faint tinge of color that had ever been seen there. "My robe is of snow," she faltered. "If I go outside these crystal walls into your radiant presence, it will surely melt." "You look as if you yourself would melt at my first caress, you beautiful living snowflake," replied the prince. "But have no fear. See, I have my own mantle ready to enfold you. Come, princess, and trust yourself to me." Then, for the first time in her life, Princess Crystal stole out of her palace and was immediately wrapped in Prince Sunshine's warm mantle, which caused her to glow all over. Her face grew quite rosy, and she looked more than usually lovely, so that the prince longed to kiss her, but she was not one yet, and she might have been offended at his taking such a liberty. Therefore, he had to be content to have her beside him in his golden chariot with the fiery horses, which flew through space so quickly that they soon stood on the high mountain, where the dragon sat watching them through his spectacles, wondering what the princess was doing so far from home and what her father would think if he discovered her absence. It was no use explaining matters to the dragon, even had they wished to do so, but of course nothing was further from their intention. Holding Prince Sunshine's hand to give her courage, the princess approached the huge beast and timidly laid her fingers on his head. "This is very nice and soothing," thought the dragon, licking his lips. "Very kind of her to come, I'm sure. But dear me, this won't do. I'm actually going to sleep." He tried to rise, but the gentle hand prevented that. A sensation of drowsiness stole through all his veins, which would have been delightful but for his determination never to sleep. As it was, he opened his mouth to give a hiss that would surely have frightened the poor princess out of her wits, but he fell asleep before he could so much as begin it. His mouth remained wide open, but his eyes closed, and his great head began to nod in a very funny manner. Directly they were satisfied that he really slept, Prince Sunshine helped himself to the dragon's spectacles, requesting the princess not to remove her hand, lest the slumber should not last long enough for their purpose. Then he put on the spectacles, and Princess Crystal exclaimed with fear and horror when, as though in result of his doing so, she saw her beloved prince plunge his right hand into the dragon's mouth. Prince Sunshine had stood facing the huge beast as he transferred the spectacles to his own nose, and, naturally enough, the first thing he saw through them was the interior of the dragon's mouth, with the tongue raised and shot forward in readiness for the hiss which sleep had intercepted. And under the tongue was a golden casket containing the hidden treasure. The spectacles enabled the prince to see through the cover, so he learned the secret at once, and knew why the king of the north was so anxious to possess himself of it. The great treasure being a pair of spectacles exactly like those hitherto always worn by the dragon, and by him alone, which would keep the king informed of all that was going on in every corner of his kingdom, so that he could always punish or reward the right people, and never make mistakes. Also, he could learn a great deal of his neighbors' affairs, which is pleasant even to a king. The princess was overjoyed when she knew the casket was already found. She very nearly removed her hand in her eagerness to inspect it, but, fortunately, she remembered just in time, and kept quite still until Prince Sunshine had drawn his chariot so close that they could both get into it without moving out of reach of the dragon's head. Then, placing the spectacles, not in their accustomed place, but on the ground just beneath, and laying the golden casket on the princess's lap, the prince said as he gathered up the reins, "Now, my dearly beloved Crystal, really mine at last, take away your hand and let us fly, without an instant's delay, to the court of the king, your royal father." It is well they had prepared for immediate departure. Directly the princess's hand was raised from the dragon's head, his senses returned to him, and, finding his mouth open ready for hissing, he hissed with all his angry might, and looked about for his spectacles that he might pursue and slay those who had robbed him, for, of course, he missed the casket at once. But he was a prisoner on that mountain and unable to leave it, though he flapped his great wings in terrible wrath when he saw the prince and princess, instead of driving down the miles and miles of mountainside as he had hoped, being carried by the fiery horses right through the air, where he could not reach them. They only laughed when they heard the hiss and the noise made by the useless flapping of wings. Prince Sunshine urged on his willing steeds, and they arrived at the court just as the king, Crystal's father, was going to dinner, and he was so delighted at having the treasure he had so long coveted that he ordered the marriage to take place at once. Prince Sunset called just in time to be best man, looking exceedingly gorgeous and handsome, though very disappointed to have lost the princess, and the festivities were kept up all night, so that Prince Sunrise was able to offer his good wishes when he came early in the morning, flushed with the haste he had made to assure Prince Sunshine that he bore him no ill will for having carried off the prize. Princess Crystal never returned to her palace, except to peep at it occasionally. She liked going everywhere with her husband, who, she found, lived by no means an idle life, but went about doing good, grumbled at sometimes, of course, for some people will grumble even at their best friend, but more generally loved and blessed by all who knew him. End of Princess Crystal or the Hidden Treasure by Isabel Bellerby.
The Squire's Bride in Fairy Tales from the Far North by P.C. Asbjornsen, translated by H.L. Brackstad. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Peter Dann. The Squire's Bride. Once upon a time there was a rich squire who owned a large farm and had plenty of silver at the bottom of his chest and money in the bank besides. But he felt there was something wanting, for he was a widower. One day the daughter of a neighbouring farmer was working for him in the hayfield. The squire saw her and liked her very much, and as she was the child of poor parents, he thought if he only hinted that he wanted her, she would be ready to marry him at once. So he told her he had been thinking of getting married again. "Aye, one may think of many things," said the girl, laughing slyly. In her opinion, the old fellow ought to be thinking of something that behoved him better than getting married. "Well, you see, I thought that you should be my wife." "No, thank you all the same," said she. "That's not at all likely." The squire was not accustomed to be gainsaid, and the more she refused him, the more determined he was to get her. But as he made no progress in her favour, he sent for her father, and told him that if he could arrange the matter with his daughter, he would forgive him the money he had lent him, and he would also give him the piece of land which lay close to his meadow into the bargain. "Yes, you may be sure I'll bring my daughter to her senses," said the father. "She is only a child, and she doesn't know what's best for her." But all his coaxing and talking did not help matters. She would not have the squire, she said, if he sat buried in gold up to his ears. The squire waited day after day, but at last he became so angry and impatient that he told the father if he expected him to stand by his promise, he would have to put his foot down and settle the matter now, for he would not wait any longer. The man knew no other way out of it but to let the squire get everything ready for the wedding. And when the parson and the wedding guests had arrived, the squire should send for the girl as if she were wanted for some work on the farm. When she arrived, she would have to be married right away, so that she would have no time to think it over. The squire thought this was well and good, and so he began brewing and baking and getting ready for the wedding in grand style. When the guests had arrived, the squire called one of his farm lads and told him to run down to his neighbour and ask him to send him what he had promised. "But if you are not back in a twinkling," he said, shaking his fist at him, "I'll—" He did not say more, for the lad ran off as if he had been shot at. "My master has sent me to ask for that you promised him," said the lad when he got to the neighbour. "But there is no time to be lost, for he is terribly busy today." "Yes, yes, run down into the meadow and take her with you. There she goes," answered the neighbour. The lad ran off, and when he came to the meadow, he found the daughter there raking the hay. "I am to fetch what your father has promised my master," said the lad. "Aha," thought she, "is that what they are up to?" "Ah, indeed," she said, "I suppose it's that little bay mare of ours. You'd better go and take her. She stands there tethered on the other side of the peas field," said the girl. The boy jumped on the back of the bay mare and rode home at full gallop. "Have you got her with you?" asked the squire. "She's down at the door," said the lad. "Take her up to the room my mother had," said the squire. "But, master, how can that be managed?" said the lad. "You must just do as I tell you," said the squire. "If you cannot manage her alone, you must get the men to help you," for he thought the girl might turn obstreperous. When the lad saw his master's face, he knew it would be no use to gainsay him. So he went and got all the farm tenants who were there to help him. Some pulled at the head and the forelegs of the mare, and others pushed from behind, and at last they got her up the stairs and into the room. There lay all the wedding finery ready. "Now that's done, master," said the lad, "but it was a terrible job. It was the worst I have ever had here on the farm." "Never mind, you shall not have done it for nothing," said his master. "Now send the women up to dress her." "But I say, master," said the lad. "None of your talk," said the squire. "Tell them they must dress her and mind, and not forget either wreath or crown." The lad ran into the kitchen. "Look here, lasses," he said, "you must go upstairs and dress up the bay mare as bride. I expect the master wants to give the guests a laugh." The women dressed the bay mare in everything that was there, and then the lad went and told his master that now she was ready dressed, with wreath and crown and all. "Very well, bring her down," said the squire. "I will receive her myself at the door," said he. There was a terrible clatter on the stairs, for that bride, you know, had no silken shoes on. When the door was opened and the squire's bride entered the parlour, you can imagine there was a good deal of tittering and grinning. And as for the squire, you may be sure he had had enough of that bride, and they say he never went courting again. End of The Squire's Bride by P.C. Asbjornsen, translated by H.L. Brekstad.
The Story of Panch in Simla Village Tales by Alice Elizabeth Draycott. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Colleen McMahon. The Story of Panch. There was once a weaver who had the habit of slapping his face to kill any flies that settled upon it, and it was rumored that he killed 5 at every blow, so he got the name of Panch, which means a killer of 5. People did not know that this name applied to flies, but thought the weaver a brave, strong man, able to kill 5 of his enemies at a blow, so that he gained a reputation for bravery. One day, the Raja of that place heard some enemies were coming in force to attack his capital. All the fighting men were required to go out and meet them on the morrow, so Panch received notice to be in readiness also. Now, he had never touched a weapon in his life, and was so horribly frightened at the very idea, so he made up his mind to run away during the night. He saddled his donkey, and taking 2 large millstones, set out on his journey. But as he was passing the enemy's camp, and arrived at a hill just a little above it, the donkey began to kick and to bray, and the 2 stones rolled down the hill into the enemy's camp with a great noise. They thought an army was after them and became terror-stricken, so that in the darkness and panic which ensued, many of them were killed. Panch was greatly delighted at his good luck, and instead of running away, returned to his own home. Next morning, when the soldiers came to call him out to fight the enemy, he very proudly asked, "What enemy? Did I not go out at night and kill hundreds of our enemies and drive the rest away?" True enough, there was now no camp to be seen, and several dead men were found on the spot. So Panch reputation as a brave man spread far and wide, and he was handsomely rewarded by the Raja. Some days after, news came that a tiger was prowling about, and a brave man was required to go out that night and kill it. Who was so brave as Panch? So he was deputed to go, but when he heard of this, he nearly died of fright and made up his mind that he would run away. So when darkness fell, he crept out and caught his donkey by the ear, and led it to its stable, and there tied it to a post to wait till he was ready to get on its back. But when he returned with a light, what was his surprise to find that it was not his donkey, but the tiger that he had led by the ear and tied to a post. Such brave conduct from a mortal to a wild beast had so amazed the tiger that it was too frightened to resist, so there it remained till morning, and Panch was thought to be the bravest man alive. Next morning he got up early and went out into the field near his house, and there he suddenly came face to face with the fierce eyes and grinning teeth of a jackal. His other bravery was by mistake, but this was reality, and so frightened was he that he fell down and died on the spot. End of The Story of Panch by Alice Elizabeth Draycott. Read by Colleen McMahon.
Boots Who Make the Princess Say, That's a Story, in the Junior Classics Volume 1, by Sir George Webb Dasent. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by Katerina. Boots Who Make the Princess Say, That's a Story. Once upon a time there was a king who had a daughter, and she was such a dreadful storyteller that the like of her was not to be found far or near. So the king gave out that if anyone could tell such a string of lies as would get her to say, "That's a story," he should have her to wife, and half the kingdom besides. Well, many came, as you may fancy, to try their luck, for everyone would have been very glad to have the princess, to say nothing of the kingdom, but they all cut a sorry figure, for the princess was so given to storytelling that all their lies went in at one ear and out of the other. Among the rest came 3 brothers to try their luck, and the 2 elder went first, but they fared no better than those that had gone before them. Last of all, the 3rd, Boots, set off and found the princess in the farmyard. "Good morning," he said, "and thank you for nothing." "Good morning," said she, "and the same to you." Then she went on. "You haven't such a fine farmyard as ours, I'll be bound, for when 2 shepherds stand, one at each end of it, and blow their ram's horns, the one can't hear the other." "Haven't we, though?" answered Boots. "Ours is far bigger, for when a calf starts to cross a field, it is a full-grown cow when it reaches the other end." "I dare say," said the princess. "Well, but you haven't such a big ox after all, as ours yonder, for when 2 men sit, one on each horn, they can't touch each other with a 20-foot rule." "Stuff," said Boots. "Is that all? Why, we have an ox who is so big that when 2 men sit, one on each horn, and each blows his great mountain trumpet, they can't hear one another." "I dare say," said the princess. "But you haven't so much milk as we, I'll be bound, for we milk our cows into great pails and carry them indoors, and empty them into great tubs, and so we make great, great cheeses." "Oh, you do you?" said Boots. "Well, we milk ours into great tubs, and then we put them in carts and drive them indoors, and then we turn them out into great brewing vats, and so we make cheeses as big as a great house. We had, too, a dun mare to tread the cheese well together when it was making, but once she tumbled down into the cheese, and we lost her, and after we had eaten at this cheese 7 years, we came upon a great dun mare, alive and kicking. Well, once after that I was going to drive this mare to the mill, and her backbone snapped in 2, but I wasn't put out, not I, for I took a spruce sapling and put it into her for a backbone, and she had no other backbone all the while we had her. But the sapling grew up into such a tall tree that I climbed right up to the sky by it, and when I got there I saw a lady sitting and spinning the foam of the sea into pig's bristle ropes, but just then the spruce fir broke short off, and I couldn't get down again, so the lady let me down by one of the ropes, and down I slipped straight into a fox's hole. And who should sit there but my mother and your father cobbling shoes, and just as I stepped in, my mother gave your father such a box on the ear that it made his whiskers curl." "That's a story," said the princess. "My father never did any such thing in all his born days." So Boots got the princess to wife, and half the kingdom besides. End of Boots Who Make the Princess Say, That's a Story, by Sir George Webb Dasent.
The Gods of Olympus, Zeus, in Greek and Roman mythology, by Jessie May Tatlock. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Gods of Olympus, Zeus. While the gods of the Greek religion were personifications of natural powers, yet they were conceived after the fashion of human beings, both in bodily form and in their needs and passions. They were born, grew, married, and suffered, though death never came to them. These beings, like men, only greater and more beautiful, must have cities and homes like those of men, only greater and more beautiful. So the Greeks of the mainland looked up to the cloudy-capped peak of Mount Olympus, majestic, mysterious, eternally enduring, and saw there, under the arc of heaven, the golden halls of the divine city. There, as they say, is the seat of the gods that standeth fast forever. Not by winds is it shaken, nor ever wet with rain, nor doth the snow come nigh thereto, but most clear air is spread about it cloudless, and the white light floats over it, wherein the blessed gods are glad for all their days. Odyssey chapter 4, line 42. It was a true celestial city, conceived after the model of the Greek city-states. At the gates of cloud, the hours stood as guardians. Within the walls rose the palaces of the gods, and on the topmost peak, the Acropolis, was the great hall where the members of the Olympic Council gathered for deliberation or for feasting. Ambrosia was the food served at these banquets, and nectar poured into cups by Hebe, the goddess of youth, nourished the ichor flowing in the god's veins instead of blood. The nostrils of the feasters were filled with the rich odor of sacrifices offered on earth, and their ears charmed by the songs that the muses sang to the accompaniment of Apollo's lyre. In the place of honor sat Zeus on his golden throne, and Hera, his sister and wife, sat beside him. Well, about them assembled the other 10 Olympians, all brothers, sisters, sons, or daughters of the Father of gods and King of men. For after his victory over the Titans, Zeus ruled supreme over heaven and earth. He challenges the other Olympians to dispute his power. Go to now, ye gods, make trial that ye all may know. Fasten ye a rope of gold from heaven, and all ye gods lay hold thereof, and all goddesses. Yet could ye not drag from heaven to earth Zeus, counsellor supreme, not thought he toiled sore. But once I likewise were minded to draw with all my heart, then should I draw you up with very earth and sea withal. By so much am I beyond gods and beyond man. Iliad, chapter 8, line 18. As sky god, he drew the clouds over the face of heaven, sending storm and rain upon the earth. Or he dispersed them, and looked down over all as benignant Father. The weapon of his anger was the thunderbolt. Victory stood at his right hand, yet his rule was not one of arbitrary violence. He was the author and promoter of law and order, of a civilized and regulated intercourse between men, of hospitality and just treatment of man by man. Hesiod calls upon the muses to sing of him in words that recall the song of the Virgin Mary. Muses of Pierre, who glorify with song, come sing of Zeus your father, and declare his praise, through whom are men famed and unfamed, sung and unsung, as Zeus Almighty will. Lightly he giveth strength, and lightly he afflicteth the strong. Lightly he bringeth low the mighty, and lighteth up the humble. Lightly he maketh the crooked to be straight, and withereth the proud as chaff. Zeus, who thundereth in heaven, who dwelleth in the high. Hesiod, Works and Days, first line. Zeus was married to his sister, Hera of the Golden Throne, a beautiful, queenly goddess, yet, as Homer portrays her, a very human woman, implacably jealous of Zeus's other loves, intrigued to get her own way, using against her lord all the traditional weapons of a woman. For all his power and majesty, Olympian Zeus went in dread of his wife's reproaches and persistency, and drew the thickest of clouds between them when he indulged in any pleasure of which she would not approve, though she had no choice but to yield when he asserted his will. She reserved to herself the compensation of taunts and a sullen demeanor. On one occasion, when he had promised a favor to another of the goddesses, this altercation took place. Anon, with taunting words, spake she to Zeus, the son of Cronus. Now, who among the gods, thou crafty of mind, have devised counsel with thee? It is ever thy good pleasure to hold aloof from me, and in sweet meditation to give thy judgments. Nor of thine own good will hast thou ever brought thyself to declare unto me the thing thou purposeth. Then the father of gods and men made answer to her, Hera, think not thou to know all my sayings. Hard are they for thee, even though thou art my wife. But whichsoever it is seemingly for thee to hear, none sooner than thou shalt know, be he god or man. Only when I will to take thought aloof from the gods, then do not thou ask of every matter, nor make question. He said, and Hera, the ox-eyed queen, was afraid, and sat in silence, curbing her heart. Iliad, 1st chapter, line 539. Though Hera was Zeus's queen and lawful wife, he united himself with many other goddesses and mortal women. Many of those unions originate as symbols of natural facts, others as symbols of philosophic truths. Thus, as sky god, god of sun and rain, Zeus must join in marriage union with Demeter, the grain goddess, that Persephone, the young corn of the new year, may be born. Again, as the great creating and regulating mind, he must unite with Mnemosyne, or memory, that the 9 muses, the goddesses of poetry, music, and science, may draw from father and mother what is needed for all great creative work. But the extraordinary number of Zeus's unions was due to the fact that Greek mythology was not the creation or inheritance of one land and people, but was drawn from the religion and traditions of Greeks in many different lands and under many different conditions. The religious traditions of many people with whom the Greeks had intercourse were incorporated by them into their own mythology. Moreover, each Greek state had its own local hero, the ancestor or early king of that group, and these heroes were always of divine origin, very many of them the sons of Zeus by mortal woman. Thus the Arcadians traced their descent from Arcas, a son of Callisto, by Zeus, of whose love the following story is told. Callisto was a nymph, a favorite companion of the huntress Artemis. One day, wandering alone in the woods, she lay down upon the ground to rest. Zeus saw her there, and thinking himself quite safe from the jealous eyes of Hera, came down secretly and wooed her. Callisto would gladly have escaped the attentions of the god and gone to rejoin Artemis and her nymphs. But who could withstand Zeus? Artemis, who as herself a maiden, would have none but maidens in her company, turned Callisto away when she would have rejoined her. Solitary and sad, the nymph lived in the woods until she bore to Zeus a son, Arcas. Now Zeus's love for Callisto was known to Hera. You shall not go unpunished, she said to the nymph, for I shall take away that beauty by which you charmed my husband's love. In vain Callisto begged for pity. Her arms began to be covered with coarse black hair. Crooked claws grew from her hands, which now served as forefeet. That face which once aroused Zeus's love was deformed by ugly, huge jaws. When she would have prayed for mercy, the power to speak was taken from her, and an angry, frightening growl was all that she could utter. But under her bear's form, her human heart, her grief, and her love remained. How often in her solitary anguish, fearing to rest in the dark woods, she sought her old home. How often was she driven away by the barking dogs. Once herself a huntress, she was now the hunted. Once she hid from the bears she met in the mountains, forgetful that she was now of their kind. So 15 troubled years passed. One day her son Arcas, out hunting wild beasts, met with his mother in the forest. She recognized her child and ran to greet him. Terrified by the rush of the great bear, he aimed at her his hunting spear. Zeus cracked his blow and raised Callisto to the heavens, where he set her as the constellation of the great bear. Hera's jealousy was not at all satisfied by this. Behold, I took from her human form, and now she's made a goddess. Is this the punishment for a guilty woman? Is this my power? She went to the sea gods and prayed that they would never permit Callisto to dip below the waves. The prayer was granted, and thus it is that the great bear can always be seen in the heavens and never sinks below the waters. Another story that shows the unrelenting hatred with which Hera pursued those favored by Zeus is that of Io. Io was the daughter of Inachus, a river god. Zeus loved and wooed and won her, coming to her secretly under cover of a cloud spread between their meeting place and Hera's watchful eyes. But the jealous queen, looking down upon the realm of Argos, and wondering to see the low-lying cloud under a clear sky, at once suspected some wrongdoings on her husband's part. She glided down from heaven and bade the cloud recede. Zeus, however, had foreseen the coming of his wife, and had changed the daughter of Inachus into a beautiful white heifer. Suspecting the trick, Hera requested the heifer as a gift, and Zeus was constrained to yield or acknowledge his love. Io was given by her mistress in charge of Argus, a monster of whose 100 eyes but 2 were closed at a time. When she would have held out supplicating hands to Argus, she had no hands to hold out. When she tried to speak, she was terrified by her own lowing. She came to the banks of the river Inachus, where she was wont to play. When she saw the reflection of her great mouth and new-formed horns, she fled from her own image in terror. The Naiads did not know her. Her own father, Inachus, did not know her. She followed her father and sisters and offered herself to be petted and admired. She licked their hands and kissed her father's palms, nor could she keep back the big tears from rolling down her nose. At last, with her hoof, she traced in the sand the letters of her own name, Io. "Woe is me," cried her father, and fell upon the heifer's neck. "I have sought you through all lands. Better were it that I had never found you." 100-eyed Argus parted them as they lamented, and put her in a new pasture. But Zeus could not endure to see her so unhappy. He sent Hermes, his son and messenger, most wily of gods, to destroy the ever-watchful Argus. Laying aside his winged sandals in disguise as a shepherd, Hermes approached Argus, who, weary of his lonely and tedious watch, called to him to come and share the shade of his tree. Seated beside Argus, Hermes piped to him charmingly on his shepherd's pipes, varying with song the long stories with which he beguiled the hours. 2 by 2 the 100 eyes were closed, until at last no eye was awake to watch his charge. Hermes at once slew him and set Io free. The 100 eyes Hera took and placed in the tail of her sacred peacock, where they may be seen today, but her jealous wrath still pursued unfortunate Io. She sent a gadfly to torment her and drive her from land to land. In her weary search for peace, the heifer passed over the strait that divides Europe from Asia, whence it derives its name, Bosphorus, the way of the cow. Over the sea, too, that bears her name, the Ionian Sea, she wandered, until at last she arrived in Egypt, where she was restored to her natural form and gave birth to a son, the ancestor of the Ionian Greeks. Antiope was the daughter of the king of Thebes. By Zeus she became the mother of 2 sons, Amphion and Zethus. Immediately after their birth, the babies were taken from her and exposed on Mount Cytherian. Antiope was the daughter of the king of Thebes. By Zeus she became the mother of 2 sons, Amphion and Zethus. Immediately after their birth, the babies were taken from her and exposed on Mount Cytherian, where they grew up among the shepherds. Antiope fell into the power of her uncle Lycus, whose wife Dyrus treated her with the greatest cruelty. After some years, she made her escape and fled to Mount Cytherian, where she happened to take refuge in the hut where her sons lived. As one of a company of Bacchantes, votaries of the wine god Bacchus, Dyrus came by chance to the same place, and finding the hated Antiope, she ordered Amphion and Zethus to kill her by tying her to the horns of a fierce bull. They were about to carry out this barbarous command when the shepherd informed them that the victim was their own mother. Releasing her, they now executed the same sentence on Dyrus, who was instantly torn in pieces by the angry bull. Lycus too was killed, and the brothers became kings of Thebes. It is said that when they were building walls about the city, Zethus' strength enabled him to lift huge stones into place, but that Amphion's skills as a musician was too great that when he played his lyre, stones yet more huge rose of themselves and took their place in the wall. The story of Baucis and Philemon shows how Zeus could reward those who respected the law of hospitality and punish those who violated it. In a certain place where now is a marsh frequented by wild birds was once a village. Here Zeus came in the guise of a mortal, and with him his son Hermes, winged sandals laid aside. They went to 1,000 dwellings, seeking rest and refreshment. All were barred against them. Yet one, a little house thatched with reeds, received them. Here good old Baucis and her husband Philemon had grown old together, taking happiness even out of their poverty by bearing it together with contented hearts. Here then came the immortals, and bending down their heads, entered the low door. The old man placed a seat and bade them sit down, while Baucis bustled to throw over in a coarse covering. Then she gathered together the dying embers, added dry leaves and fuel, and blew it into a flame with her feeble breath. Her husband brought in a cabbage from the little garden, cut a fat piece from the long-cherished flitch of bacon, and put them over the fire to cook. They shook up their cushion of soft sedge grass, laid it on the dining couch, and put over it a covering that, poor and patched though it was, they used only on great festivals. While the gods reclined on the couch, the trembling old woman, with skirts tuckered up, set out the table. One foot of the table was uneven, a brick steadied it, and a handful of greens cleaned off the top. The feast began with olives, stewed berries, endive, radishes, cottage cheese, and eggs carefully fried, all served in earthenware dishes. After this, the mixing bowl and cups, made of beech wood lined with smooth wax, were set out for the wine. Not rich old wine, but the best they had. There were nuts, figs, dried dates, plums, and fragrant apples served in baskets, and purple grapes gathered from the vines, and in the middle of the table the honeycomb. Above all, there were cordial looks and eager goodwill, and now the astonished couple began to notice that the mixing bowl, as often as it was emptied, filled up again of its own accord. They trembled, and holding out their hands in supplication, asked forgiveness for the humble fare. There was one single goose, the guardian of the little farm. This is its master's, now prepared to slaughter for the divine guests. It escaped them, and flapping its wings, dodged about the little room, and at last took refuge at the feet of the gods. The immortals forbade its slaughter. We are gods, they said, and while this neighborhood pays the penalty for its inhospitality, you shall be free from misfortune. Leave your house and follow us. The two old people obeyed, and hobbing along with their sticks, climbed the hill. When a little way from the top, they looked back and saw all the village covered by marsh. Only their own house was left. While they wondered and bewildered their neighbor's fate, the little old hut of theirs was transformed. In place of the forked stick supporting a roof thatched with reeds, rose marble columns crowned with gilt beams. The doors were of embossed metal, and the pavement of marble. When the son of Cronus spoke, "Ask, righteous old man and worthy woman, what you will." Philemon consulted a moment with Baucis, and then asked, "We ask to be priests and to keep your shrines, and since we have lived happily together, let the same hour take us both, and let me never see the grave of my wife, nor have to be buried by her hands." Their prayer was granted. They were guardians of the temple as long as they lived. One day, as they stood side by side before the temple, each saw a change come over the other. Now their forms, bent with age, grew straight and strong, and rooted firmly in the earth. Then, as the waving treetops grew over their heads, each said, "Farewell, O wife, O husband," and then the bark covered their mouths. And so, in after years, the shepherds pointed out the oak and the linen growing side by side and said, "The gods care for the godly and protect those who do them service." Zeus was represented in art as a man of generous build and a majestic bearing, usually draped from his waist down. His head was massive, his brows heavy, his hair and beard extremely thick, as though his face looked out from masses of piled thunder clouds. Beneath his overhanging eyebrows gleamed those eyes whose glance was lightning, and a heavily lined forehead forebode that frown at which the heavens shook. His whole appearance was that of the majestic and powerful god of heaven and earth. He was generally represented as seated upon a throne, holding in one his scepter or a spear, and in the other his weapon, the winged thunderbolts. With him often appeared the eagle, the bird that by his bold heavenward flight and lightning descent upon his prey was associated with the sky god. On his scepter or beside him appeared a winged female figure, Victory, for he held the balances of fate and gave victory to this or that warrior as he willed. Among the Greeks themselves, the statue most admired was that of gold and ivory set up in the temple at Olympia in southern Greece. Before the representation of the greatest of their gods, Greeks from all parts of the Hellenic world met once in every 4 years to offer sacrifice and to compete in athletic contests, honoring their divinity by the exhibition of perfect bodies under perfect control. So great was the honor paid to successful contestants that the most famous lyric poets of Greece devoted their genius to celebrating them in hymns, which were sung by choruses to the accompaniment of the lyre or flute, when the victors returned to their own cities in tranquil state. Moreover, the greatest sculptors joined to do them honor, for the proudest glory of an Olympic victor was the right he gained of having his statue set up in the precinct of the god. As one walks now through the ruins of Olympia, here he can make out the plan of the Palestra, in whose wide spaces Greek youth wrestled, ran races, rivaled one another in throwing the discus. Here was the long colonnade or stoa beneath whose shade poets read their work. In front, long rows of statues of youths, nude as they appeared when winning their victories. Here was the line of treasures of all the states of Greece, and in the center, even now impressive for the great drums of its columns, fallen and piled in confusion by the earthquakes of centuries, rise the high foundations of the great temple of Olympian Zeus. At Dodona in Epirus was a famous oracle of Zeus, one of the oldest holy places in all Greece. Here the priestess read the will of the god from the sound of the rustling leaves of the great oak, a tree especially sacred to Zeus. In every part of the Greek world were places set apart for his worship, and each state claimed his favor for some special reason. As late as early Christian times in Crete, the grave of Zeus was pointed out, for conceptions of immortal gods were strangely combined with thoughts of death. Zeus was identified by the Romans with their old Latin god, Jupiter or Jove, and the stories told of the one were transferred to the other. Jupiter was originally a sky god as Zeus was, and king of gods and men. Temples in his honor crowned many high hills in Italy, and he was called upon to send rain in time of drought. On the Alban Mount, the temple of Jupiter Latiaris was a religious center of the Latin Confederacy. Jupiter Optimus Maximus was worshipped on the Capitoline Hill at Rome as guardian of the state and giver of victory in war, and to him generals returning victories to celebrate a triumph offered the best of the spoils of war. Like Zeus, the Roman Jupiter was the protector of right and truth, and the sanctity of oaths. End of Gods of Olympus, Zeus, by Jessie May Tatlock. Read by Janckee.
The Castle of Anoush in Armenian Legends and Poems by Raffi. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recorded by L. Knight. The Castle of Anoush. Anoush in name, but full of bitterness in reality. On one side of the road that leads from Tisbin to Ecbatana stands a steep, pointed crag. Its massive base rises from an extensive bed of rock, on which nature has placed it as on a firm pedestal. Not a handful of earth is to be found upon its denuded surface. Not a single plant grows on its hard, stony sides. The burning rays of the southern sun have dried and baked it like an earthen vessel in the potter's ever-burning fire. From time immemorial that rock has ever been so. It happened one day that Farhat, the great Persian sculptor, passed at the foot of the rock with his pickaxe on his shoulder. He was aroused suddenly from the deep meditation in which he had been lost by the sound of horns and trumpets. He stopped. Greyhounds and hawk-bearers appeared. Gay and thoughtless riders burst into sight like a storm, then passed away from sight like a storm. The dim, shadowy outline of a face remained in his heart. That vision stole away his peace of mind. Every day at the same hour he was to be seen on the road waiting with the tenderest feelings of his heart aroused. The beloved vision would appear, and after throwing a careless glance at him would pass by like a flash of lightning. He lost his peace of mind, abandoned his art, and wandered like one beside himself in the solitudes of the mountains. Days passed, weeks passed, and months passed. One day he was sitting there waiting. She appeared, but this time there were neither greyhounds nor hawk-bearers with her. She was alone with a number of her maidens. She urged her horse on and came up to Farhat. "Hail, great master," she said. "What has chained thee to these mountains, to the solitudes of these desert places? I ever see thee here." "The joy of sometimes seeing a transcendently beautiful vision light up the solitudes of these desert places," answered Farhat. Is thy love so great then? She asked, smiling. Who can help loving her that is not a peer amongst the immortals? Who can help loving her whose breath gives life, whose one glance confers eternal happiness? Do you think that the heart of him that is ever occupied with the stone and the chisel becomes so hardened that there is no room left in it for beauty? I think not so. He that can give form and life to a shapeless stone, he that creates beautiful beings out of cold marble, cannot but love what is beautiful himself. But listen, artist. To win the heart of the daughter of the Aryan king requires great sacrifices. I know that great goddesses require great sacrifices. I do not demand what is impossible. I only wish to try thy love. Look, Farhad, dost thou see yonder rock? And she pointed to the sharp crag. Thou must create palaces for me out of that rock, so that I may look down from the summit with delight and watch how the Tigris threads the beautiful plains of Assyria with its silvery curves, or how the tall palm trees of Pakistan wave at the breathing of the gentle zephyrs. And in the heart of the rock thou must make storehouses for my treasures, and underneath there must be dwelling places for my horses. When all this is ready, I shall be thine. She spoke and rode away. Years passed away. The pickaxe and hammer of the master worked untiringly at the unyielding rock. The ceaseless sounds of the heavy blows were to be heard day and night. The work was carried on successfully. Love strengthened the genius of the great master, and the beauty of the Aryan king's daughter fired him with enthusiasm. He made chambers, he made staterooms, he made halls decorated with pictures, and out of the solid rock he created a palace of marvelous beauty. He made the walls of the apartments live with pictures carved in relief. In one place he sculpted the battles that the old heroes and giants of Iran had fought with devils and evil spirits. In another, the glory and greatness of the ancient kings of Iran, and festivals celebrating their victories and deeds of prowess. He drew on the stone the valiant acts of ancestral kings, their virtues, and the benefits that they scattered over the land of the Aryans. He worked all these wonders for the one being to whom he had devoted all the passion of his love. He worked them all so that she might be continually reminded of the glorious past of Iran, that her heart might continually be rejoiced with the noble pride that she was the descendant of a great dynasty born of the gods, which had always done godlike deeds. She came and saw it all. "It is very beautiful," she said, "but there is no water here. There are no trees. Make fountains for me that shall throw the water up higher than the clouds. Plant trees for me under whose shadow I may rest. Rest in thine arms." She spoke and rode away. He turned the courses of far distant streams and brought the water by underground channels to the very summit of the rock. He shaped the stone, dug out basins, and created silvery fountains. Day and night the never-ending supply of water rose out of the fountains, and dewed the surrounding plants with pearl-like drops. He leveled the surface of the rock, and covered it with earth brought from distant places. He planted trees and made lofty hanging gardens that looked as if they were growing in the air. Years passed. The trees grew and gave fruit. The flowers blossomed and filled with scented gardens, with their gladdening perfumes. The birds came and filled the place with their happy songs. But she, who was to have been the queen and pride of that beautiful paradise, did not appear. One day the master sat at the foot of the palace he had made, leaning his chin on his hand and looking sorrowfully down the road. A peasant came up singing, and sat down beside him to rest a little. "Whence comest thou?" asked the master. "Thou art fortunate in being so happy." "From Tisben," said the peasant. "And why should I not be happy when all the world is rejoicing?" "What has happened?" "Dost thou not know that in town the wedding has already been going on for 7 days and 7 nights? The wine is flowing in rivers, and there is no limit to the dainty fare. They are eating, drinking, and making merry. The whole town resounds with the strains of music, and the feet of the dancers are never weary. I also came in for my share of good things. I ate and drank as much as I could, and now I am taking home what will be enough for my wife and children for many weeks." "Whose wedding is it?" "The king's." "To whom is he married?" "To Anoush." The master spoke no more. He only started as one struck by lightning, then remained motionless. Then he rose and walked with weak, trembling steps towards the palace he had created. He looked around, and for the last time raised his sorrowful eyes to all the work that was the result of passionate love and beautiful art. Then he entered into his workroom. His tools were lying about. He took up a heavy hammer and came out onto the narrow ledge. "She deceived me," he said, and threw the hammer up into the air. It turned over and over, then fell onto his head. His warm blood sprinkled the wonders that were the work of his hands. Farhad did not obtain the desire of his heart, but the name of his beloved Anoush remained with that stone fortress, and it was called the Castle of Anoush. That rock-hewn palace which was prepared to be the temple of love and everlasting happiness became a hell full of tears and unending suffering. It was there that the kings of Persia imprisoned the Armenian kings who fell captive into their hands. End of The Castle of Anoush by Raffi.
Told on the Pagoda, Tales of Burma, The Stolen Treasure by Mimosa, read in English. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. In a lonely part of a large forest, there dwelt 4 wise men of India who owned a treasure consisting of gold, silver, and great jewels. Like all property, it was a source of great anxiety to its owners, for they always feared that it would be stolen from them. With that idea, they constantly watched it, counted it, and changed its hiding place, burying it sometimes under trees or in a ruined well that stood not far distant, at other times with them in the house. For many long years they had kept it safely thus, so safely indeed that gradually they grew a little less zealous in their guardianship. The confidence born of long and unmolested peace made them somewhat careless, and so in some inexplicable manner news of its existence floated to the ears of a young man who dwelt in the town not so many miles away, and he at once made up his mind that he would become possessed of it. Being wise, he only took counsel of himself, and bided his time with much patience. He made the acquaintance of the 4 recluses, and watched their movements and studied their habits with much diligence. He was a handsome, high-spirited youth, with manners that were frank and engaging, and the old men liked to see him and talk to him, soon growing to look forward to his visits. Months passed, and he went to see them often. They conversed unreversedly before him, and trusted him as one of themselves. As time passed and no opportunity of taking the treasure offered itself, he began to be impatient, and was indeed almost reduced to despair when he learnt, to his inexpressible pleasure, that they intended going on a day's pilgrimage in the near future. He laid his plans. When the day came, he rode to the forest on a pony, and dismounting, fastened it near by, as was his custom, and went within. The garden, with its moss-overgrown, decayed walls, was quite still save for the song of the birds. The sun fell through the leaves of the trees and made brilliant patches of light on the grass. The rooms of the house were dark and cool and empty. There were the broken remains of a meal, and various things belonging to the absent master scattered about. The visitor looked around and about him carefully, peering here and there. Then, having quite satisfied himself that only he and the feathered world shared the stillness, he smiled. Some hours later the pilgrims returned home. They had been far and were wearied. They rested for a while, then ate their evening meal and prepared to make ready for the night. As was customary with them, they went to look at the treasure where they had put it in an upper room, to find to their unspeakable horror and dismay that it was gone. They looked on one another in mute amazement and despair. They beat their breast. There were no words to describe what they felt in that hour when they bewailed its loss in a helpless, hopeless way. After a while one of them said, "He who has come here so many times of late with fair words and fairer smiles, it is he who hath done this thing." The others agreed that it was only he who could have, for no one else had ever penetrated to their abode or shared their confidence. Too late, they bitterly rued having ever received the stranger. They sat long that night talking. One said, "We have no proof save our own conviction that he whom we met as a friend and a brother has robbed us. Therefore, what can we do?" The others answered him, "We will seek the king. To our requests he has always lent a kind and willing ear." Meanwhile, homeward through the sultry night rode a horseman with a heavy load. When the dawn broke, they who had been robbed set out together to seek the court of the king. His Majesty, who was revered for his goodness, had one daughter who to a keen intellect united great beauty, and was renowned throughout her father's dominions and even in countries beyond the sea. Whenever the king or his ministers were perplexed as to how to act in any particular matter, they invariably consulted the princess, who on each and all such occasions had guided them aright, while no chicanery or fraud ever passed her undetected. All that was brave, lofty, and good she admired, honored, and followed. All that was mean, low, and dishonest she abhorred. United to a powerful mind were many womanly, gracious, and charitable qualities, which made her beloved in humble circles as well as respected in high ones. Therefore, when the four petitioners sought the king, it was with the idea of humbly pleading for the princess's assistance. The king, who knew them, received them at once on their arrival, and listened to all that they had to say, agreeing with them in their suspicions. He asked them, when he had heard their story, if they could identify the property if they were to see it anywhere, to which they answered, "Yes." Then, bidding them rest and refresh themselves, he went himself to the apartments of his daughter and told her the tale that he had heard. She was very much interested, and gladly promised to do what she could, telling her father that if the young man could be found and brought to the palace, she fancied that she could restore to them their lost goods. Whereupon the king consulted the four, and a messenger was sent to search and bring the young fellow with as little delay as possible. The envoy of his Majesty found him whom they desired, with but little difficulty, who received the royal summons with much astonishment and some fear. Instinctively he felt that it was with regard to the stolen jewels that he was sent for, and he trembled not a little as he set out. Were the theft ever to be discovered, he knew full well that his punishment would not be a light one. Almost he felt inclined to regret that he had ever embarked on so hazardous a course, but then the memory of the shining heaps of gold and silver and the glittering stones and all that they represented came to him, and he laughed and shook off all feelings of fear. For how, after all, he said to himself, could they prove that it was he who was the thief? When he arrived at the palace, therefore, he was quite light-hearted, and walked through the lines of servants with a haughty, self-confident air. They ushered him through many halls, and at last into a large and most beautifully decorated apartment situated at the end of a long vista of salons. The four walls had bas-reliefs of graceful figures of women in colored marble, and uncut jewels. The hangings were of ivory satin, embroidered with elephants and dragons and dead gold. From the ceiling were suspended magnificent lamps of many finely blended colors. A large fountain splashed softly nearby. This floor was strewn with tiger skins. The air was heavy with strong perfume, while the light from without stole in subdued and cool through green blinds. But what riveted the visitor's attention beyond all else was a couch of immense dimensions stretching across the upper end of the room, reclining on which amongst many cushions was a woman. Overhead was a canopy of fringed cloth supported by delicately chased silver poles inlaid with turquoises. On a table of mother-of-pearl stood some cheroots and a glass globe of water. Several attendants, gorgeously attired, lounged near, and created a breeze with fans made of real roses. The lady herself was very handsome, with a clear skin of an almost olive color, great eyes of velvety darkness, and a soft, slow, sweet smile. Pearls clasped her throat, diamonds shone on her fingers, while gold bracelets glittered on her slender bare ankles. She motioned her somewhat bewildered visitor to seat himself near, and signed to the attendants to withdraw. He felt terribly nervous in the presence of this royal lady. She watched him in silence for a few moments, fanning herself languidly the while. She was uncertain as to how to open the conversation. He was very handsome, certainly, she thought, as she looked, and with a figure as lithe and graceful as that of a panther. She raised herself a little and leant forward slightly. He started and looked at her apprehensively. "I suppose," she began, "that you are wondering why I sent for you?" The tones of her voice were strangely liquid and clear. The young man murmured something indistinctly in response. She continued, "But for some time past, when the king and myself have gone abroad, we have seen you often and have desired to know you." The listener was trembling so with joy, relief, and surprise at hearing such words that he could find naught to say in reply. Then she, perceiving his agitation, spoke to him gently and kindly for a few minutes, in order to give him time to recover his self-possession. Then, when he was more composed, she asked him many questions about himself, questions which he gladly answered. Then after a while she bade him go and to return on the morrow. So he went from the seductive presence of the princess with his head in a whirl, and feeling as if he dwelt no longer on earth but in nirvana. On the morrow he returned, and for many days following not a question was ever asked. He was ushered always into the same room, where he was greeted most graciously. On the occasion of his fourth visit, after the princess had conversed with him on many subjects, she asked him somewhat suddenly if he was betrothed or married. And when he answered that he was not, it seemed to him that she appeared pleased. Then, after a long silence fell between them, which he of course did not attempt to break. "My friend," she said at last, and her manner was somewhat nervous and embarrassed, "I am glad that your affections are not placed elsewhere, because I myself, strange as it is for a woman to tell a man, desire to wed with you. To my father's court have come many who have sought my hand in marriage, but in none have I seen those qualities which I admire and esteem." She paused. The low, thrilling words stole on the listener's ear in sweet, subdued cadence. Did he hear aright? He doubted it. He feared that he only dreamt. Then he looked at her where she sat, with her shimmering jewels glancing 1,000 hues, and his heart throbbed and his brain reeled, and he was as if drunk with wine. He knew not how to answer this beautiful, gracious lady. How she must love him, he thought, when she could so stoop from her high estate. He dropped on his knees before her. "Ah," he murmured, "where could I find fitting expressions in which to tell you what I feel? Your words have lifted me to complete nirvana, and I shall never dwell on earth again. Speech is but a poor thing often, therefore I will not say much. Deeds are best. It is by them, O princess, that you shall read my heart." She smiled, and her eyes were softly tender as they met his. "There is but one thing," she said, after a few moments. "My father must not be told till after we are married. He would not sanction our union, though he will forgive us afterwards. Therefore you must take me hence, away from out the kingdom for some time. Then, when my father's anger, just anger, shall have faded, as it surely will, we will return together." The young man listened in rapt attention, scarcely crediting even yet his own great fortune. "And yet I scarcely see," gravely pursued the princess, after a short silence, "how it can be managed." She rose as she spoke, and advanced to where a box of ivory, inlaid with opals, stood, touched a spring and opened it. "See," she cried, "this is all the money I own," taking in her hands a few small worthless pieces of silver. "I have never required money till now. All that I have ever wanted has been always beside me." "Do not fear if it is only money that you need," answered the young man, "for of that I have more than enough." "Ah, is that so?" she exclaimed eagerly, turning to him a face of glad surprise. "At home," he continued, "I have much of jewels and gold which I got but little while back, sufficient to keep us in that luxury which is due to your rank for many a year to come. "Go and fetch it," urged the princess, "and return here at nightfall, and I will go with thee to another life, a life of happiness such as this world seldom holds." Her great eyes glittered as she spoke. He read in her words, her looks, and her gestures only the fond impatience of a love long, secret, and denied. He prostrated himself, and saying, "I will return at nightfall," left her to hurry on his errand. In the early evening, when the darkness had only just fallen, he drove in a carriage to the palace. He left it at a little distance from the great gold entrance, and taking on his person much of his stolen treasure, he was ushered into the princess's room. The swinging lamps were lit, and shed a faint radiance on all around. She was by herself, and greeted him in a manner that left nothing to be desired. Wishing to assure her of the existence of that money and those jewels that he had spoken of, and feeling nervously elated, he drew from the recesses of his turban and sash a handful of great stones that were as rivers of light. She gave a woman's delighted cry as she took them in her hands. He smiled, well pleased, and tendered a great ruby of wondrous size and blood-red fire. "These are but a few of what I have," he said. "How rich you must be!" she exclaimed. "From whence did all these things come from?" "Ah, princess, what matter whence they came? Sufficient it is now that they are yours." As he spoke, she, unseen by him, touched a gong of curious workmanship that stood near. Then she held the stones up to the light, praising their beauty and worth, and asking many questions. A short while passed, and then a great door at the end of the room opened, and the king entered, followed by the 4 fakirs, and advanced to where his daughter sat. The young man's heart beat in alarm at the sight of those whom he had robbed, and the princess's first words did not tend to decrease the feeling. "Are these some of the treasures that you have lost?" she asked, handing to the elder of the 4 the biggest of the diamonds and the rubies. He took them in his hands and passed them to the others, saying at the same time, "These are ours." "There stands the thief, then," said the princess, pointing now to the now cowering, shaking figure of the culprit, who looked piteously from one to the other, feeling at the same time very enraged with himself for having been so easily caught in the trap that had been laid for him. "It is for you," continued the princess, addressing herself to the 4, "when your entire treasure has been restored to you, to name his punishment." The elder of them answered, "We are so rejoiced to regain that which we had feared was lost forever, princess, that we are willing that he should go forth unchastised. His conscience and what it will say to him will be his punishment." "That would be too light a sentence, for I doubt much if he has any conscience," said the lady, as she seated herself. "Then, princess, will you relieve us by sentencing himself yourself, as you best will?" craved the 4. "No," she answered, "that I cannot do. I might be too harsh. I have convicted him. Let his majesty, who is ever lenient, name his punishment." Then they all turned to the king, who said, "I command that he be banished from this land forever, and any property that he has, or is likely to have, be confiscated." End of The Stolen Treasure by Mimosa. Told on the Pagoda, Tales of Burma, a Fable by Mimosa, read in English. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. 2 dogs walked in the jungle together. The day was intensely hot. The rays of the sun, hardly tempered with any shade, fell through the towering bamboos and palm trees down on their tired heads. They had come far. The way was very rough, the undergrowth very tangled and dense. There seemed to be no end to it. Their vision in front was obscured by the extraordinary wealth of orchids and green foliage that was gracefully but thickly festooned from branch to branch. Snakes glided away in the deep grass. Monkeys, squirrels, and birds of all kinds contended for the undisputed possession of the different trees. "I'm very much tired. I don't think I can go much farther," said the lady dog, who was small and delicate, to her companion. "So am I," was the answer. "It was foolish ever to have come," grumbled the first. "It was your fault," snapped the second. "I did not say it wasn't, did I?" retorted the other, who, female-like, had the last word. Then they went on in silence for a while. They both felt cross and hungry, and when you are hungry and a dog, bananas are not very satisfying, and they were the only things near. Presently they came to where a small stream flowed. The water was quite warm, but they drank it and were grateful. Then they rested, going on again just when the last rays of the sun still showed above the dusky palm tops. They hoped to reach a village before nightfall, but they were doomed to be disappointed. There was not a sign of any habitation near when the darkness began to close around. The stars twinkled brightly in a clear violet sky of wondrous brilliancy. Close behind them was a tiger's den, empty. They crept in and sank down, too wary to go further. There were signs of it having been recently occupied, but they did not heed them, and gnawed ravenously at some half-eaten bones that were strewn about. Then they curled themselves up in one corner and slept. After a few hours, the lady dog woke up and looked about her. Through the opening she saw the moonlight falling on the countryside outside. Everything was strangely still, save for the distant cry of the jackal and the healthy snoring of her spouse, who reposed in the corner. She felt alarmed. She could not exactly have told why, and awakened her companion, who grumbled not a little at being thus rudely roused from his slumbers. "Supposing," began his companion, not heeding his displeasure, "that the tiger was to return." "What?" cried the listener, sharply jumping up in extreme alarm at the bare suggestion. "Don't make that unearthly noise," said the lady calmly. "I only said supposing, and I was going to ask you what we should do in such a case." "Do? Why, what could we do?" "Nothing, of course," was the somewhat contemptuous reply. Just then an ominous crackling of the branches outside made them prick their ears. Creeping close to the opening, they looked out and saw in the distance a large tiger coming towards them. A white light, clear almost as the dawn, fell about him, showing his big head and striped back. The watchers trembled exceedingly, and their teeth rattled. "There is no time to be lost," explained the lady in a hoarse whisper. "We must trust to his never having seen any like us before, and we must try and frighten him." "Humbug and nonsense! Fancy our frightening a tiger," said the gentleman dog with infinite scorn. "Never mind, we'll try. You sit at the door while I remain here. When I roar, well, you'll see the effect." The dog very unwillingly took up his position at the entrance to the lair, and waited. In a second almost the great beast came slouching along. His gleaming eyes glanced hither and thither, and there was blood upon his mouth. Seeing the dog, he came to an abrupt pause, and stared, then came a little nearer, but very cautiously. Just then there came a cry from within, accompanied by the words, "I am hungry, very hungry, and so are the little ones. They crave more tiger's flesh. Be quick and bring it." The tiger, hearing, waited for no more, but turned and fled into the night. He knew not what he had seen, but the words that he had heard had turned him cold with fear. He flew on away into the wood, not heeding where he went. Then, just as the first rose flush of dawn overspread the sky, he sank down exhausted, with a cold perspiration all over him. He fell into a troubled, weary doze, from whence he was awakened by a banana dexterously aimed, hitting him in the eye. Looking up, he saw a brown monkey swinging itself on the branch of a tree opposite, and regarding him with all that gleeful self-satisfaction which a monkey is alone capable of. "Well, my friend," it cried, mockingly, "what has put you out? You look strangely pale and upset this morning." I have had sufficient cause, answered the tiger, rising and shaking himself. For when I went home last night, I found it filled by the most peculiar-looking animals that I have ever seen, who shouted for my flesh. The listener cocked its ugly little head on one side as it munched bananas, and asked, "What were they like?" "Don't ask me," exclaimed the tiger. "I was too frightened to see anything save that they were white." The monkey flung itself up higher among the boughs, and laughed loudly and long. "If you don't stop that hideous noise, I'll kill you," called out the tiger very angrily, regardless of the fact that he could not get within miles of his tormentor. "Ha ha, my friend," shouted the monkey. "The things that you were frightened of were two poor lean dogs that went by here yesterday. What a great coward you are!" "Coward or no coward, they would have killed me and eaten me." "Eaten you? Oh, you great silly goose! With all your travels you don't know any more than that dogs can't kill you. You can kill dogs." "I don't believe you," protested the tiger stolidly. "Don't then," said the monkey laconically as he turned a somersault. There was silence for a while. The tiger sat down dejectedly while the monkey watched him through the leaves and chuckled maliciously, continuing to eat noiselessly as he watched. Having once had sufficient himself, he was not indisposed to be a little generous, so, taking some berries in one brown paw, he climbed down nearer the ground and tendered them to his melancholy friend as an overture, saying as he did so, "Eat and forget for a while." "I can never forget the loss of my dear home," was the melancholy reply. "Nonsense," retorted the other one, who was practical, not sentimental, and who had 100 homes all equally comfortable in the forest. "It's no nonsense," said the tiger, shaking his head. "Well," exclaimed the monkey after a few seconds, "if you really are afraid to go back, which is ridiculous, I'll come with you, for I fear no dogs." "I wouldn't trust you," replied the tiger ungraciously. "You have played me a scurvy trick or two before now." The monkey became indignant, saying, "It is just like your mean, suspicious nature to speak so to a friend who, out of pure good nature, is willing to do you a turn. What motive can I have save generosity? No good can accrue to me personally." The tiger grunted an unwilling assent, and began to think seriously of accepting the offer. "Well," he said at last, "if you will consent to be tied to my tail, and to go in first to the den, my back being to you, and face the dog, I am willing." "Agreed," answered the monkey, who was an interfering little creature, and was longing to have his finger in the pie. So they went, the monkey tied to his friend's tail, chattering all the way. "Now," said the tiger, who was sullen and afraid as they came in sight of his lair, "if you don't behave fairly to me, I will murder you. That's all." "Never fear. I won't give you the opportunity of carrying out your amiable intention, because I shall act only as your true friend," replied the monkey. Then he pushed aside the thick growing foliage and entered into the cave, the tiger keeping as far away as possible, his hind legs inside and the rest of him out. The dogs were lying down, but roused themselves on seeing their visitor. "Well, monkey," shouted one, "so you have come at last, but that," looking behind him, "is a very lean tiger that you have brought. Why do you do so when you know that we like them so sleek and fat and—" But the monkey heard no more. He was gone, jerked violently away by the tiger, who, suspecting his fidelity all along, was convinced of his perfidy by the words of the dog's greeting. Away, away he sped, without turning back, over hill and dale. Bump, bump, bang, bang, went the poor monkey's body, while he vainly protested his innocence in breathless, terrified shrieks. At last death came and ended his pain. The two dogs sat and watched them till their eyes grew tired. They laughed greatly as one said to the other, "See what happened to the monkey for interfering in other people's business." End of a Fable by Mimosa.
How Thor Lost His Hammer in Asgard Stories by Mary H. Foster and Mabel H. Cummings. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. How Thor Lost His Hammer. Come, Loki, are you ready? My goats are eager to be off, cried Thor, as he sprang into his chariot, and away they went, thundering over the hills. All day long they journeyed, and at night they lay down to rest by the side of a brook. When Balder, the bright sun god, awoke them in the morning, the first thing Thor did was to reach out from Mjolnir, his magic hammer, which he had carefully laid by his side the night before. "Why, Loki," cried he, "alas, my hammer is gone. Those evil frost giants must have stolen it from me while I slept. How shall we hold Asgard against them without my hammer? They will surely take our stronghold." "We must go quickly and find it," replied Loki. "Let us ask Freya to lend us her falcon garment." Now the goddess, Freya, had a wonderful garment made of falcon feathers, and whoever wore it looked just like a bird. As you may suppose, this was sometimes a very useful thing. So Thor and Loki went quickly back to Asgard, and drove with all speed to Freya's palace, where they found her sitting among her maidens. "Asgard is in great danger," said Thor, "and we have come to you, fair goddess, to ask if you will lend us your falcon garment, for my hammer has been carried off, and we must go in search of it." "Surely," answered Freya, "I will lend you my falcon cloak, even if it were made of gold and silver." Then Loki quickly dressed himself in Freya's garment and flew away to the land of the frost giants, where he found their king making collars of gold for his dogs and combing his horses. As Loki came near, he looked up and said, "Ah, Loki, how fare the mighty gods in Asgard?" "The Aesir are in great trouble," replied Loki, "and I am sent to fetch the hammer of Thor." "And do you think I am going to be foolish enough to give it back to you, after I have had all the trouble of getting it into my power?" said the king. "I have buried it deep, deep down in the earth, and there is only one way by which you can get it again. You must bring me the goddess Freya to be my wife." Loki did not know what to say to this, for he felt sure that Freya would never be willing to go away from Asgard to live among the fierce giants. But as he saw no chance of getting the hammer, he flew back to Asgard to see what could be done. Thor was anxiously looking out for him. "What news do you bring, Loki?" cried he. "Have you brought me my hammer again?" "Alas, no," said Loki. "I bring only a message from the giant king. He will not give up your hammer until you persuade Freya to marry him." Then Thor and Loki went together to Freya's palace, and the fair goddess greeted them kindly, but when she heard their errand, and found they wished her to marry the cruel giant, she was very angry, and said to Thor, "You should not have been so careless as to lose your hammer. It is all your own fault that it is gone, and I will never marry the giant to help you get it again." Thor then went to tell Father Odin, who called a meeting of all the Aesir, for it was a very serious matter they were to consider. If the king of the giants only knew the power of the mighty hammer, he might storm Asgard and carry off the fair Freya to be his bride. So the Aesir met together in their great judgment hall in the palace of Gladsheim. Long and anxiously they talked over their peril, trying to find some plan for saving Asgard from these enemies. At last Heimdall, the faithful watchman of the Rainbow Bridge, proposed a plan. "Let us dress Thor," said he, "in Freya's robes, braid his hair, and let him wear Freya's wonderful necklace and bridal veil." "No, indeed," cried Thor angrily. "You would all laugh at me in a woman's dress. I will do no such thing. We must find some other way." But when no other way could be found, at last Thor was persuaded to try Heimdall's plan, and the Aesir went to work to dress the mighty thunder god like a bride. He was the tallest of them all, and of course he looked very queer to them in his woman's clothes, but he would be small enough beside a giant. Then they dressed Loki to look like the bride's waiting maid, and the two set off for Utgard, the stronghold of the giants. When the giant king saw them coming, he bade his servants make ready the wedding feast, and invited all his giant subjects to come and celebrate his marriage with the lovely goddess Freya. So the wedding party sat down to the feast, and Thor, who was always a good eater, ate 1 ox and 8 salmon, and drank 3 casks of mead. The king watched him, greatly surprised to see a woman eat so much, and said, "Where hast thou seen such a hungry bride?" But the watchful Loki, who stood nearby as the bride's waiting maid, whispered in the king's ear, 8 nights has Freya fasted and would take no food, so anxious was she to be your bride." This pleased the giant, and he went toward Thor, saying he must kiss his fair bride. but when he lifted the bridal veil, such a gleam of light shot from Thor's eyes that the king started back and asked why Freya's eyes were so sharp. Again Loki replied, "For 8 nights the fair Freya has not slept, so greatly did she long to reach here." This again pleased the king, and he said, "Now let the hammer be brought and given to the bride, for the hour has come for our marriage." All this time Thor was so eager to get his treasure back that he could hardly keep still, and if it had not been for what the wily Loki said, he might have been found out too soon. But at last the precious hammer was brought and handed to the bride, as was always the custom at weddings. As soon as Thor grasped it in his hand, he threw off his woman's robes and stood out before the astonished giants. Then did the mighty Thunderer sweep down his foes, and many of the cruel frost giants were slain. Once more the sacred city of Asgard was saved from danger, for Thor was its defender, and he was careful never again to let his magic hammer be taken from him. Besides the hammer, Thor had 2 other precious things: his belt of strength, which doubled his power when he tightened it, and his iron glove, which he put on when he was going to throw the hammer. "I am the god Thor, I am the war god, I am the Thunderer. Here in my Northland, my fastness and fortress reign I forever. Here amid icebergs rule I the nations. This is my hammer, Mjolnir the mighty. Giants and sorcerers cannot withstand it. These are the gauntlets wherewith I wield it, and hurl it afar off. This is my girdle. Whenever I brace it, strength is redoubled." Longfellow. End of How Thor Lost His Hammer. Retold by Mary H. Foster and Mabel H. Cummings.
The Bird of Paradise. In the Crystal Palace and Other Legends by Marie H. Frary and Charles Maurice Stebbins. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Bird of Paradise. There once lived in the monastery at Heisterbach a kindly monk of great learning and simple manners. He had studied for many years that he might settle some doubts that troubled him. He had observed that people grew tired of even the best of things. They desire to behold new scenes and hear new music and to taste new dishes. "I wonder if it will be so in heaven," he said to himself. "Shall we not grow weary of beauties and joys of heaven in the endless flow of ages?" This question perplexed him sorely, but he was unable to answer to his satisfaction. Worried about the doubt, he decided to put it away from him if possible. So one beautiful sunny morning in summer, he turned his steps toward the woods that stretched away for miles back of the monastery. It was such a morning as makes one glad to be alive. Silvery clouds were floating like great white ships across the blue sky. The gentle breeze was playing among the branches of the trees, flowers were blooming, and the birds were singing happily everywhere. Earth seemed to breathe forth peace and joy for all mankind. Beauty and blessing were everywhere. Yet, with all of this to gladden him, Alphys was not satisfied. His heart was not at ease. "Alas," he sighed, "how all is changed. The rapture with which I first looked upon this lovely scene is gone. The beauty with which it greeted me is no more. Why must it be so?" As Alphys was pondering on this thought, he wandered on, paying no attention to the path he was following. Hour after hour passed, and still he walked on, until finally he became weary and decided to rest. He sat down on a mossy bank and began to look about him. It was a beautiful spot, and one which he had never visited before, although he thought he was familiar with every place in the forest. The trees were tall and leafy. The branches stretched out, forming beautiful arches above him. At his feet were delicate ferns and wildflowers of many different colors. He heard the drowsy hum of the bee and saw a beautiful butterfly flitting about from flower to flower. His admiration was awakened. It seemed as if he saw a new beauty in the things about him, and he forgot that he was tired. Suddenly, there came to him the song of a bird, which seemed to be the sweetest he had ever heard. He looked and saw the bird perched upon a tree nearby. It seemed to pour forth its song in one strain of perfect happiness. It seemed so thrilling and so beautiful that Alphys could not think it earthly. With an intense delight, the monk leaned back against the mossy bank, listening to the strain. The song lasted but a moment and ceased, as suddenly as it had begun. Alphys desired to hear it again. He looked for the bird and waited, but it was gone. Around him, all was silence. Even the breeze seemed to have ceased its rustling among the leaves of the trees. The monk slowly rose and began his way back through the woods to the monastery. But how everything seemed to have changed. Could it be that he was in a part of the woods he'd never visited before? He, too, did not seem to be the same. His steps were now halting and slow, and all his body seemed feeble and stiff. As he looked at his beard, he saw that it was gray. He walked on in amazement. The trees seemed to have become much larger since he entered the forest. Even the bushes had grown into tall trees. He wondered if he was dreaming or if he had lost his mind. Slowly and painfully, he picked his way back through the dense forest, and after several hours of walking, came to the open land. Eagerly, he looked up to the monastery, but that too had changed. It was older and grayer than before, and seemed to have increased in size. A new portion had been added, and the entrance gate was not the same, which it stood there when he left in the morning. Everything looked older. What could have happened? He had been gone but a few hours, yet all the world had changed. It seemed as if he were in another century. Alphys paused his hand across his eyes as if to clear his sight and anxiously walked on. As he passed the fountain at the village, he saw some women washing, but they were new to him. Yet he had known every woman, man, and child for miles around. Whence had these strange faces come? "Look," cried one of them as the old man passed by. "This ancient monk wears the dress of the order, yet his face is new to me. I've never seen him before. Who can he be?" To this strange remark, Alphys paid no heed. He only hastened on the faster. He was beginning to doubt his senses. He went directly to the gate of the monastery, but this was much larger than it had been when he left. He rang the bell. The sound was no longer the same. The silvery peal of the bell he had known had given place to the harsh clang of a much larger one. At length, there came a young monk to open the door. Alphys was amazed. It was a stranger, a man whom he had never seen before. He gazed at him, speechless. "What has happened?" he said. "Why are all things so changed? Where is Brother Antony? Why does he not open the door as usual?" "Brother Antony!" exclaimed the monk. "There is no such person here. I am the porter, and no one but me has opened this door for the last 20 years. For a moment, poor Alphys stood on the threshold as if petrified. Then he beheld 2 monks slowly passing along the corridor. They too were strangers, but he reached forward and clutched one of them by the gown. "Brethren," he cried in agony, "I beseech you, speak. Tell me what has happened. Only a few hours ago I left the monastery for a quiet walk in the woods, and now when I come back, behold, all is changed. Where is the abbot? Where are my companions? Is there no one here who remembers Alphys?" "Alphys, Alphys," repeated one of the monks thoughtfully to himself. "There has been no one of that name here for 100 years. There was once a man by that name in the monastery, but he disappeared long ago. I remember hearing about him when I was a small lad, but whether the story is true or not, I cannot tell. He went one morning as often was his custom, to walk in the forest alone, the monk went on, and they never heard from him afterward. The monk sought for him throughout the forest day after day, but no trace of him could be found. He seemed to have vanished from the earth. The abbot thought that God must have borne him up to heaven in a chariot of fire like Elijah. He was a very holy man indeed, but all this happened so long ago that it may simply be a story. At these words, a sudden light seemed to shine in the face of poor Alphys. He sank to his knees and clasped his trembling hands as if in prayer. Now I understand, O God, that 1,000 years are but as a day in thy sight. A whole century passed while I held my breath to listen to the song of the bird which sings at the gate of paradise. Forgive my doubts, O Lord, and grant that I may enter into thy rest. As the monks looked at Alphys, they saw that a great calm had settled upon his face. A radiant smile played about his lips. He sank back gently upon a settle, and the wondering monks crowded about him, but to their astonishment, he did not move. And when they looked more closely, they saw that his pure soul had flown away to his heavenly mansion, there to enjoy the endless ages of unchanging happiness. End of The Bird of Paradise, read by Kathy Hollingsworth, Springdale, Arkansas, May 7th, 2021.
Book 1. The Coming of Thuadae Dunnan in Gods and Fighting Men. The story of the Thuadae Dunnan and of the Fianna of Ireland. Arranged and put into English by Lady Gregory, with a preface by Y.B. Yeats. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Book 1. The Coming of Thuadae Dunnan. Chapter 1. The Fight with the Firbolgs. It was in a mist the Thuadae Dunnan, the people of the gods of Dann, or as some called them, the men of Dea, came through the air and the high air to Ireland. It was from the north they came, and in the place they came from, they had 4 cities, where they fought their battle for learning. Great Phalius, and shining Gorius, and Phineus, and rich Murius that lay to the south. And in those cities they had 4 wise men, to teach their young men skill, and knowledge, and perfect wisdom, Ceneus and Murius, and Arius, the fair-haired poet, in Phineus, and Urius of the noble nature in Gorius, and Morius in Phalius itself. And they brought from those 4 cities their 4 treasures, a stone of virtue from Phalius, that was called the Leifol, the stone of destiny, and from Gorius they brought a sword, and from Phineus a spear of victory, and from Murius the 4th treasure, the cauldron that no company ever went away from, unsatisfied. It was Nuada, was king of the Thuadae Dunnan at the time. But Mannanan, son of Lear, was greater again, and of the others that were chief among them were Ogma, brother to the king, that taught them riding, and Dionsect, that understood healing, and Nate, a god of battle, and Cretinus, the craftsman, and Godnu, the smith, and the greatest among their women were Bov, a battle goddess, and Maika, whose mast feeding was the heads of men killed in battle, and the Moragu, the crow of battle, and Er, and Fodla, and Banba, daughters to the Dagda, that all three gave their names to Ireland afterwards, and Aidan, the nurse of poets, and Bridget, that was a woman of poetry, and poets worshipped her, for her sway was very great and very noble, and she was a woman of healing along with that, and a woman of smith's work, and it was she first made the whistle for calling one to another through the night. And the one side of her face was ugly, but the other side was very comely. And the meaning of her name was Breoseged, a fiery arrow. And among the other women there were many shadow forms and great queens. But Dana, that was called the mother of the gods, was beyond them all. And the three things they put above all others were the plough, and the sun, and the hazel tree. So that it was said in the time to come that Ireland was divided between those three, Cole the hazel, and Sect the plough, and Grian the sun. And they had a well below the sea, where the 9 hazels of wisdom were growing, that is, the hazels of inspiration and the knowledge of poetry. And their leaves and their blossoms would break out in the same hour, and would fall on the well in a shower that raised a purple wave. And then the 5 salmon that were waiting there would eat the nuts, and their color would come out in the red spots of their skin. And any person that would eat one of those salmon would know all wisdom and all poetry. And there were 7 streams of wisdom that sprang from that well and turned back to it again. And the people of many arts have drank from that well. It was on the first day of Beltane, that is now called May Day, that Thuaday Danann came. And it was to the northwest of Connacht where they landed. But the Firbolgs, the men of the bag, that were in Ireland before them, and that had come from the south, saw nothing but a mist, and it lying on the hills. Aechid, son of Eri, was king of the Firbolgs at the time, and messengers came to him at Timor, and told him there was a new race of people come into Ireland. But whether from the earth, or the skies, or the wind, was not known, and that they had settled themselves on Magrain. They thought there would be wonder on Aechid when he heard that news, but there was no wonder on him. For a dream had come to him in the night, and when he asked his druids the meaning of the dream, it is what they said, that it would not be long till there would be a strong enemy coming against him. Then King Aechid took counsel with his chief advisors, and it is what they agreed, to send a good champion of their own to see the strangers and to speak with them. So they chose out Shreng, that was a great fighting man, and he rose up and took his strong red-brown shield, and his 2 thick-handled spears, and his sword, and his head covering, and his thick iron club. And he set out from Timor, and went on towards the place the strangers were, at Magrain. But before he reached it, the watchers of Thuaday Danann got sight of him, and they sent out one of their own champions, Bress, with his shield, and his sword, and his 2 spears, to meet him and to talk with him. So the two champions went one towards the other slowly, and keeping a good watch on one another, and wondering at one another's arms, till they came near enough for talking, and then they stopped, and each put his shield before his body, and struck it hard into the ground. And they looked at one another over the rim. Brez was the first to speak, and when Shrang had heard it was Irish he was talking, his own tongue, he was less uneasy. And they drew nearer, and asked questions as to one another's family and race. And after a while they put their shields away, and it was what Shrang said, that he had raised his in dread of the thin. Sharp spears Brez had in his hand, and Brez said he himself was in dread of the thick-handled spears he saw with Shrang, and he asked were all the arms of the Firbolg of the same sort, and Shrang took off the tyings of his spears to show them better, and Brez wondered at them, being so strong and heavy, and so sharp at the sides that they had no points. And Shrang told him the name of those spears was Krasek, and that they would break through shields and crush flesh and bones, so that their thrust was death or wounds that never healed. And then he looked at the sharp, thin, hard-pointed spears that were with Brez, and in the end they made an exchange of spears, the way fighters on each side would see the weapons the others were used to. And it is the message Brez sent to the Firbolgs, that if they would give up one half of Ireland, his people would be content to take it in peace. But if they were to not give up that much, there should be a battle. And he and Shrang said to one another that whatever might happen in the future, they themselves would be friends. Shrang went back then to Team Air and gave the message and showed the spear. And it is what he advised his people, to share the country and not go into battle with a people that had weapons so much better than their own. But Akid and his chief men consulted together, and they said in the end, "We will not give up half of the country to these strangers, for if we do," they said, "they will soon take the whole." Now, as to the men of Dea, when Brez went back to them, and showed them the heavy spear, and told them of the strong, fierce man he had got it from, and how sturdy he was and well armed, they thought it likely there would soon be a battle. And they went back from where they were to a better place, farther west in Connacht. And there they settled themselves, and made walls and ditches on the plain of Magnea, where they had the great mountain, Belgasa, in their rear. And while they were moving there and putting up their walls, 3 queens of them, Bav and Maika and Morrigu, went to Timur, where the Firbolgs were making their plans. And by the power of their enchantments, they brought mists and clouds of darkness over the whole place. And they sent showers of fire and blood all over the people, the way they could not see or speak with one another through the length of 3 days. But at the end of that time, the 3 druids of the Firbolgs, Caesern, Nadhacht, and Ignahacht, broke the enchantment. The Firbolgs gathered their men together then, and they came with their 11 battalions and took their stand at the eastern end of the plain of Magnea. And Nuada, king of the men of Dea, sent his poets to make the same offer he made before, to be content with the half of the country if it was given up to him. King Achid bade the poets to ask an answer of his chief men that were gathered there. And when they heard the offer, they would not consent. So the messengers asked them, when would they begin the battle? We must have a delay, they said, for we want time to put our spears and our armor in order, and to brighten our helmets, and to sharpen our swords, and to have spears made like the ones you have. And as to yourselves, they said, you will be wanting to have spears like our Krasiks made for you. So they agreed, then made a delay of 1/4 of a year for preparation. It was on a midsummer day they began the battle. 3 times 9 hurlers of the Thuadae Dann went out against 3 times 9 hurlers of the Firbolgs, and they were beaten, and every one of them was killed. And the king, Achid, sent a messenger to ask, would they have the battle every day or every second day? And it is what Nuada answered, that they would have it every day. But there would be just the same number of men fighting on each side. Achid agreed to that, but he was not well pleased, for there were more men of the Firbolgs than the men of Dea. So the battle went on for 4 days, and there were great feats done on each side, and a great many champions came to their death. But for those that were alive at evening, the physicians on each side used to make a bath of healing, with every sort of healing plant or herb in it, the way they would be strong and sound for next day's fight. And on the 4th day the men of Dea got the upper hand, and the Firbolgs were driven back, and a great thirst came on Achid, their king, in the battle, and he went off the field looking for a drink, and 350s of his men protecting him. But 350s of the Thuadae Dann followed after them, till they came to a strand that is called the Treathoil, and they had a fierce fight there. And at last, King Achid fell, and they buried him there, and they raised a great heap of stones over his grave. And when there were but 300 men left of the 11 battalions of the Firbolgs, and Shrang at the head of them, Nuada offered them peace, and their choices among the 5 provinces of Ireland. And Shrang said they would take Connacht, and he and his people lived there, and their children after them. It is of them Ferdiad came afterwards, that made such a good fight against Cuchulainn, and Erc, son of Cabre, that gave him his death. And that battle, that was the first fought in Ireland by the men of Dea, was called by some the first battle of Mag Terder. And the Thuadae Dann took possession of Timor, that was sometimes called Drum Cain, the Beautiful Ridge, and Leath Drum, the Grey Ridge, and Drum Nadeskin, the Ridge of the Outlook. All those names were given to Timor. And from that time, it was above all other places, for its king was the high king over all Ireland. The king's wrath lay to the north, and the hill of the hostages to the northeast of the high seat, and the green of Timor to the west of the hill of the hostages, and to the northeast, in the hill of Seed, was a well called Nemmok, and out of it there flowed a stream called Neath, and on that stream the first mill was built in Ireland. And to the north of the hill of the hostages was the stone, the Leofale, and it used to roar under the feet of every king that would take possession of Ireland. And the wall of the Three Whispers was near the house of the women, that had 7 doors to the east, and 7 doors to the west. And it is in that house the feast of Timer used to be held. And there was the great house of 1,000 soldiers, and near it, to the south, the little hill of the woman soldiers. End of Book 1. The Coming of Thuaday Danann. Arranged and put into English by Lady Gregory, with a preface by W.B. Yeats. Read by Elisandro Beltran, Los Angeles, April 27th, 2021.